the principles of effective business communication. Okay, so the first thing we need to do in this part of business literacy is we need to be able to distinguish between verbal and non-verbal communication. And the important thing is when we talk about verbal communication, it includes both spoken and written communication. Okay? And then also both verbal and non-verbal communication can be either visual or non-visual. And so I've given you a little table there with 4 different blocks in it. The first one is examples of communication that is both visual and verbal. That'll be all written communication and all face-to-face communication. Then you can get communication that is verbal, but it is non-visual. And that would be recordings without accompanying slides, of course, announcements, and things like telephone calls. The next category is communication that is visual but non-verbal, and there we can think of cartoons, cartoons without the character speaking, pictures, body language, and facial expressions. And then lastly, we have a non-communication that is both non-verbal and non-visual. There you can think of something like an alarm that's going off. You know exactly what to do, uh, but it's neither verbal nor visual. Instrumental music can communicate very powerfully, but it is neither visual nor verbal. And then tone of voice. From the tone of somebody's voice, you can gather that what they say and what they mean might not be the same thing at all. So when we talk about verbal communication, I already said to you, we have both spoken and written communication. Just a couple of examples of spoken communication as we will be using it in the workplace. You can think of meetings, interviews, client visits, product presentations, brainstorming sessions, announcements over an intercom system if you have an intercom system, and then, of course, telephone calls. Written communication, you can think of reports and faxes and notices, uh, memos, press releases, and then, of course, the minutes of meetings. And the two that take up a lot of our time in the workplace, emails and any short messaging system, or multimedia messaging system that it forms part of our written communication. Of course, multimedia messages is everything. They are written and spoken and all at the same time. Okay, like this. This is a multimedia presentation. I'm showing you my PowerPoint slides while at the same time I am speaking to you and you can hear my voice, so you are hearing the spoken communication and at the same time you are seeing the written communication that I'm sharing with you. Okay. So when we just a couple of examples here of visual non-verbal communication. So this is communication. It's visual. We see it, but it's non-verbal. So first thing there is facial expressions, gestures, and posture. Frowning, for example, can indicate displeasure. You can point at somebody to identify them. Okay, you've seen these courtroom dramas. Is the suspect in this courtroom? And then the guy point at somebody in the courtroom, and then nothing else needs to be said. Fiddling with keys can indicate that the person that is speaking is nervous. Standing upright indicate confidence, while sloping shoulders can indicate disappointment. Now, it also works the other way. I mean, even if you're not that confident, but you stand up straight while you are presenting, you will become more confident, of course. Things that we know very well if we ever use Microsoft Office are the icons. And I've given you a couple of icons that I just snipped from my computer screen there. You see the Teams icon, you see the Explorer icon, you see the Google Chrome icon, You see the little camera there. I think that one is for Zoom. You see the Outlook icon, and then the control panel icon. Those are all things that are pinned to my taskbar, and I know what they are. I don't need to be told what they are, and there doesn't have to be a little something written underneath for me to know when to utilize it. Then we get signs there. These are common workplace signs telling you where the emergency exit is and that you must take the stairs and not the lift, showing you where the emergency assembly point is. That's not entirely true, that one, because it has some writing on it. So it is indeed verbal. And then the one that people seem to misunderstand all the time, because I go to shopping centers and I still see able-bodied people parking in disabled parking bays, which has that sign. What that sign is really a man in a wheelchair. But really, people with other disabilities can also stop in those stopping areas. It's just you don't need to have a wheelchair. And then, of course, emoticons. Now, I'm not too good at these. Some people know what all these emoticons mean. So I've just given you 8 there: a happy face, a confused face, an anxious face, and embarrassed face, a content one, frustrated one, and perplexed one, or a scared one. Can't really see too well. I see my my taskbar is a little bit in my way. Okay. The next thing we can look at is non-visual, non-verbal communication. So these are examples of things that are non-visual and non-verbal. And we have Edwards Hall's proxemics zones there. And he says that these zones are zones that we allow people into. And they are non-visual because these markings that I've given you there, these distances, are not marked out on the ground. Nobody says to people, don't you get to within 1.2 meters of me or I will beat you up. See, that's just weird. But this is how it works. So we only allow intimate people that we love into our intimate zones. And that is really up to 46 centimeter, less than half a meter. We allow family and friends into our personal zone, and that is about 46 centimeter to 1.2 meter. Acquaintances, we will allow acquaintances into our social zone, which is about 1.2 meter to 3.7 meter. 3.7 is getting a little bit far. And then everyone else falls into the public zone, and that is 3.7 meters to 7.6 meters. But even as I say that to you, we must realize that proxemics is strongly influenced by culture. If you grow up in a community where the population density is extremely high and people share common spaces on a day-to-day basis, these zones might be a lot smaller. If you grow up on a farm where the closest neighbor is 3 kilometers away, these zones might be much larger. But Edward Hall was the guy who brought these zones to us. Then we also get this idea of mixed and implied messages. Okay, so mixed messages are confusing, so therefore you must check before you publish. Okay, I've given you 3 examples there. There's a headline in this newspaper. The headline says "Stop tweeting," but unfortunately, it's directly under the little space on the page where they encourage you to follow them on Twitter, the Standard News. The editor should have noticed that, and he didn't. The next one, I assume, is a mistake because it says cell phone use is allowed, but clearly you have a not allowed sign there through the cell phone. So maybe there's a not missing there. And then the one furthest to the right there, you have a sign in white at the bottom that says keep right, but yet right on top of that, you have a sign that says that the road is going towards the left. That is actually possible. So yes, the road is curving to the left, but it's in a country where people drive on the right-hand side and you must keep right. But it's still confusing if you don't understand exactly what those signs mean. And then sometimes what also can happen is that what somebody is saying and their body language are not in tune. And while they say something, that's the overt message. There's also an implied message in there, and the implied message can be very different. So there you have a lady, and what she's saying is, "I love bungee jumping." That's the words coming out of her mouth. But if you look at her, you can see that she is petrified, and the implied message is that I am scared to death. Um, I think this might be the last thing I ever do in my life. On the right-hand side there, you have a guy with a baker's hat. I guess he's a baker or chef, a baker because he's got the rolling pin in his hand. And he is saying, "Welcome to my kitchen." But he's lifting the rolling pin above his head and it looks like he's going to smash your head in. And the implied message is, "Stay away." Okay, so while the overt message might be, "Welcome to my kitchen," the implied message is most certainly, "Stay away, don't come in here." Okay, and so therefore we must always make sure that our expressions, words, and actions say the same thing. Okay, you will remember in the beginning of part 1 of this module, we talked about if listening and how we spent a lot of time listening in the workplace. Now, listening must be effective. If we're going to spend so much time listening, we better know how to listen properly. Okay. So listening, what is it? It is a dynamic, cyclical process, and that is all happening at the same time. So what I'm saying to you is that everything that we see underneath there, all those different phases in the listening cycle, happens at the same time. Okay, you don't stop interpreting at some point and now you're only listening. You're doing everything at the same time, and it's a cyclical process, but it's also dynamic. So it is, you're not just passively sitting there listening. Listening is a dynamic process, and there are two different classifications of it there that I've given you, one under the other. But really, it's much the same. It's just the authors that chose to really classify this a little bit differently. The first thing that we do is hearing. So when we are listening, we must hear. Now, hearing is a passive activity, but also not too passive because it requires that we actively ignore all noise. Okay, so then that's the hearing. After the hearing, you have the filtering. That is the deliberate manipulation of information. Then there is the interpreting, which is to make sense of it or to understand it. And then there is the remembering, where we recall or think about it again. Okay. Under that, I showed you classification doesn't make use of the four aspects, but indeed of a fifth aspect as well. So here you have receiving, understanding, evaluating, remembering, and responding. And you know what all of those means. Okay, where am I now? Okay, different types of listening. First way you can listen, or these are all good ways to listen really, is active listening, where you are looking for the main purpose of the message. You try to find that main purpose as quickly as possible. You are focusing on the message and not on anything else that the speaker might be doing. And you exchange with the speaker to validate that you understand it. So you are actually engaging. Okay. Then there is critical listening. You are listening, but you are continually evaluating, analyzing, and questioning. That is the way reporters will listen to a politician. And then the next day, they write a very long article on a 5-minute speech. And when you read it, think to yourself, man, I listened to that speech. I didn't pick up on any of these. That's because you were maybe an appreciative listener, while the reporter was a critical listener. And so our experience of the same message will be different. What is appreciative listening? Well, it is where we listen, we evaluate, and we respond in a way that shows the speaker that we are indeed appreciating it. So we not, we evaluate and we remark positively. I never thought of it that way. Huh? Wow, congratulations, things like that. And then we have reflective listening, and reflective listening is really a combination of the other types that's up there. The listener hears the message. He tries to understand it from the sender's point of view. He or she checks own understanding and interpretation, and then respond appropriately, giving feedback that can either be verbal or non-verbal. Okay. There are different types of communication barriers. The ones on the left there is really the way your textbook choose to classify the different types of communication barriers. And that is as physical, which can be a physical noise or distance. I'm simply too far away for you to hear me. Psychological, where it could be a disability. I could have a speaking disability where I speak with a lisp or I stutter, and it makes it more difficult for you to understand. Or you can have a hearing disability, and I need to speak louder, or you find difficult to interpret my words. Then it can be psychosocial, which refers to attitude and emotions. And it can also be perceptual, which refer to prejudices. You just don't like people who speak like me in a thick Afrikaans accent. And so you think, oh man, he uh, he must have fallen on his head as a kid. Okay, that's maybe the prejudice that you hold. Okay, silly example, but it works in any case. Now, on the far right hand side there, you see I talked about reference barriers. Now, sometimes the reference barriers can be either psychosocial in terms of attitude or emotions, or perceptual. And or it could be, as there's at the bottom, the intercultural. Okay. So you relate better to somebody from certain cultural background or from the same cultural background, and so you find it difficult to communicate with people that is not of the same cultural background. Okay, attitudes. You don't like people who eat broccoli. You find out that I like broccoli. Your logical conclusion is therefore that I am a man of poor tastes, and that effect becomes a barrier to the communication between us. Emotions. Okay. I'm trying to explain to you what a wonderful day it is today, but unfortunately, it's the same day on which your cat died. You are sad, and you don't want to listen to anybody that is telling you how fantastic a day it is. Ego. Okay. Sometimes we listen to somebody and the person is very confident, but we say he thinks too much of himself. Okay, especially if it is somebody from a opposition political party IQ. Okay, some people talk in or move around in circles where everybody is of the same social status and might be all qualified and degreed people, and will therefore not listen to somebody that they perceive as having a lower IQ. Okay, values. People can have different values, different beliefs, and that will, of course, influence the communication. People might relate to people of the same status. Okay, so you don't want to speak to poor people, and poor people don't want to speak to rich people, and in the meantime, we miss out on the valuable contributions that we could have had from people of a different status, and of course also education. Okay. Now, that can mean education level. It can even mean educational institute, where people really belong to an old boys club, and they relate much better to people from the same old boys club. Okay. There's also the problem back to the left-hand side now of semantic barriers, where somebody is using slang or jargon or accent. You all know that people in the IT industry speak a language that's very difficult for the rest of us to understand. And that is because they use abbreviations that other people don't understand. It's the same in the training industry and really in any industry where when people that is not of that industry comes and participate in the conversation, you actually have to watch what you are saying so that you make sure everybody else understand what you are saying about. Slang is often a specific a group within a population that wants to distinguish themselves with the language that they use, and it's really designed to identify. And everybody doesn't use that slang is not of that group. And then of course accent. Many people in the world speak English, but that does not mean that we understand everybody that speak English equally well. A person with a Scottish accent will sound completely different from a Brit that lives in London, who will sound completely different from a Brit that lives in Liverpool, who will sound completely different from somebody who speaks with thick Afrikaans accent like I do. Okay, there can also be intercultural communication barriers, and for here we can think of non-verbal greetings, where you have somebody that wants to greet by giving a high five, somebody that wants to give a firm handshake, and somebody that wants to bow. And when they all do it at the same time, somebody is going to get hurt. Okay. Now, how do we remove the communication barriers? Well, one of the first things that we can do is to reduce the physical barriers. We can create a conducive environment, okay, where we've eliminated the noise, where the people are comfortable, where the room is painted a color that leads to a calming effect, things like that. Remove any distractions. Okay, so if you know that you are a fiddler, don't pick up your keys to start with. Of course, it helps if everybody that participates in the communication is willing and open to communicate and willing and open to listen to the opinions of others. That's really helpful. Avoid jargon and slang. I've already talked about it. Okay. Face to face is still better. If we speak to somebody face to face and there is a misunderstanding, it is easier to clear up. Okay. There, you actually need to decide to trust the other person. If you go into the communication situation and you decide that you don't trust the person from the beginning, you are not going to benefit from that communication. And then, of course, listen. We already talked about listening and different ways to listen and how important it is to listen. Okay. On this last slide, it's just another slide that has classified the communication barriers a little differently. This time in terms of intrapersonal, interpersonal, structural, technological, and regulatory or custom barriers, where intrapersonal is now the perception and the communications skills of both the sender and the receiver. Interpersonal is the climate. That's not that's how hot or cold it is, but more how hot or cold the people are towards each other, whether they trust each other, whether they regard each other as credible, and how similar they are. Okay, the structural differences in this case can refer to status or group size or spatial constraints. Um, our poor teachers know all about that when they have to teach 45 people in a class that was designed to accommodate 20 people. It's very difficult. And then serial transmission, where the guy at the front is the only one who can really hear and the one behind him can't hear, and so the one behind him is asking him, hey, what did the guy say? And then he's trying to explain to the person behind him what was said, and then he misses out on what is being said. Okay, you can understand the chaos that can be caused by that. Technological barriers like language and meaning, non-verbal cues, media. I mean, wow, with media, it's interesting. The internet connection can drop, and suddenly I have to re-record this entire message. And then we also have information overload, where I give you 100 slides instead of 10 slides to look at a time. Then also regulatory and custom barriers can be things like legal frameworks, policy, and just customs. Okay, we just move in different uh, frameworks, and so therefore we misunderstand each other. Okay, guys, thank you. That is the end of part 2 of learning module 1, the principles of effective business communication. Thank